I'm sure there's going to be lots of aspects of this Israel on campus and the assault on Israel and that I won't have time to cover. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into BDS. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into all those organizations that have a thing for or a thing against Israel. I want to provide you a broad umbrella and then go down into the topic of why learning Israel, teaching Israel has become an issue or problematic. And then I'm going to finish with the last 5 or 10 minutes on my experience with Carter and show to you how Carter was a participant in the assault on Israel and show how his writings were symptomatic or emblematic or represented a whole series of authors who were writing at the time about why Israel was not good and why Israel was bad. I don't know how else to say it in direct terms. So this is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rich, this will ultimately be put up for them for access, so you'll get that. So the distance traveled in 100 years, what are the attitudinal disconnects between negativism toward Israel and what's going on in the Middle East? In other words, there is it's almost ironic that with the negative things that are happening, and you list them vis-a-vis Israel, and then you see how the Palestinians and how the Arabs look at each other and how they look at trying to resolve the Palestinian issue, you see that their frustration is over here, and they've been saying it for years, and over here there's a cadre of people who say, delegitimize Israel, distance yourself from Israel, Israel is not worthy, and that's happening pretty much in Western society, or Western societies, and whereas the other is happening on a daily basis, written by Arab editorials and editorialists and analysts about how bad the Palestinians are and how the Arab states don't care about the Palestinians like they once used to. Now, those are happening simultaneously. And is there an irony? I don't know. So this is the summary of what I just said. As assaults on Israel exist in the media, on campus, in academic associations, and elsewhere, as BDS grows, as Middle Eastern anti-Semitism increases, as Jewish youth in the U.S. are reportedly losing positive outlooks toward Israel, and as the Palestinian leadership seeks to isolate Israel internationally to weaken Israel, Palestinian and Arab writers are increasingly fed up with Arab and Palestinian political leaders, and Sunni Arab states are creating strategic alliances of convenience with Israel. That is the reality. Just is. Some of you are sitting here trying to copy it. You want me to take another minute so your fingers can do the walking through the keyboard? You're going to get it anyway. Right? You may not ever read this again. You just tell me when you want me to move forward and I'll do it. All right? State in the Middle East 100 years ago. The Ottoman Empire, we've gone from tribes to states. And that's a shorthand. Here I'm including the Jews as a tribe. Imperial and colonial presence, their departure after World War II, the Cold War, 45 to 89, states became clients of outside patrons, autocrats continued to rule, political Islam jumps onto the scene in 1979, Anwar Sadat will break all barriers and make a peace with Israel. Pragmatism will rule on some aspects of the Middle East and in trying to create relationship with the State of Israel. And that's happening while there is a harshness and a deep anxiety between Jews in America and the state of Israel for a variety of reasons, whether it has to do with the way Israel behaves socially, sociologically, religion, society, women, a whole series of churnings that are taking place. And then in the last 10 years, we have the fragmentation of Arab state structures. The demography and the economy of these countries can't hold the weight of the countries that were created after World War II. There are just too many people. The economies don't have the capacity to take care of the populations, and therefore the populations are on the move. So there's a greater degree of instability today in 2018 than there was at the end of World War II. Just the nature of what has happened in the region. So these are some statistics from peace indices. The Israel Democracy Institute, it's on the web. The Israel Democracy Institute publishes a monthly peace index in which they don't just try and evaluate what the prospects of peace are, but what they do is they poll Israelis, they poll Jewish Israelis, they poll Israelis based on left and right identity, and they poll Israelis, if they're not Jewish Israelis, they poll specifically Arab Israelis as well. So in all of their indices, and they go back to 1994, and they're the most consistent polling data that we have, and it's considered to be highly accurate. No one has ever found a bias. Yes? I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I guess I could have another carrot down here and I could say British feel this way, South Africans feel that way, Costa Ricans feel this way, those who live in the White House feel that way. Optimism and pessimism regarding the country's future. While on the right there's a clear majority of optimists, in the center 68% are optimistic. On the left there's a minority of optimists, albeit a large one. But by and large, Israelis are happy to be who they are. In the Israeli Arab public, the majority indeed say they would stay in the country even if they could move elsewhere. A small majority said they are not satisfied with the balance of the country's achievements and failures. And 33% said when it comes to Israel's future, only 33% said they are proud to be Israeli. But the point of it is, Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, left or right, are content. They're not atzbani. They're not crazed by being upset about what's going on around them. I mean, they have a less pissed off quotient than people who are outside of Israel looking at Israel. Just the distance. Among Jewish interviewees, the highest rate put reducing the tensions in Israeli society in first place, followed by improving the education system, and at the bottom of the ladder, we're signing a peace agreement with the Palestinians. American Jewish, here are the Pew studies. Jews in Israel are a majority, 80%. In the United States, we're 2%. 38% of Israelis and 66% of American Jews put security as Israel's highest priority. Look at the gap. 39% of Israelis and only 1% of Americans say economic issues are most important for Israelis. I said it last night. It would be good to know what they're thinking before we start figuring it out, that they have to be like us, or they want to be like us, or we want to be like them. Israeli Jews revealed in the personal priorities at the top of the list. 26.5% noted reducing tensions in Israeli society, followed by 22.6% for improving the education system. Only 11.5% said signing a peace agreement with the Palestinians was the top priority. Among Israeli Jews, 42% say the settlements help Israel's security, while only 70% of American Jews believe that's the case. 3-1. I think it has to do between groups, like between religious and secular, between haves and have-nots. Maybe. I'm not positive it's hawks and doves, but I think this has more to do with socioeconomic kinds of things than anything else. And look, this is all meant to give you an overview of how Israelis are perceiving themselves right now or within the last year, and how we perceive ourselves as Jews. And here, Arab and Palestinian self-criticism. This is a very famous Palestinian Arab writer who writes a year ago, the Arab Gulf in general does not view the Palestinian cause as the heart of the conflict and does not see Israel as the Arab state's main enemy. On the contrary, it views Iranian influence in the Arab region as the primary problem and believes that on the principle of my enemy is my friend, Israel can be an ally in the war on Iran. Now, if we grew up with an attitude that said Arab states are unified on the Palestinian issue, I'm asking you to put a hole in that balloon and let it go away. Just let it go. You have to remove it from your conceptual outlook. This is Palestinian and Palestinian Arabs no longer important. The strategic success posed by Arab solidarity, and the Palestinian revolution that had become an international liberation movement in Palestine was the Arab central cause have withered away. Remaining threats, Hezbollah, Hamas, organization ISIS, is diverted away from Israel by other wars and issues. The Palestinians stand alone as the weakest of conditions, with no real strong allies, after they've abandoned and disregarded their allies across the entire globe. And when together with their Arab allies, they focused all their efforts on winning the approval of Washington, Tel Aviv. 100 years after Sykes-Picot, the region's map is being redrawn by dividing up its nations alongside a series of attempts to liquidate or defer the Palestinian cause under further notice. Meanwhile, Abbas wants to go to UN. Meanwhile, they want Israel to be tried in the international court. The effort is to isolate Israel out here, but on the ground, the attitude is totally different. Totally different. No one has written about it. No one writes about it. And if it's written in an Arabic newspaper today, maybe in 6 months you'll find it in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, or the Atlantic. But that's it takes about 6 to 8 months for what's happening on the ground in the Middle East to find its way into an English audience. I don't know why. This is one of the most famous or most noted Arab writers. January 2018. Now, I'm not thrilled by this reality, but is how they see themselves. So this is the context, this is the background when I'm about to sit down and tell you or talk to you or walk about this room and tell you about what's going on campus. Two very different kinds of worlds. We've talked about all this. Zionism's evolution, Jews develop power, preserve a state, Jewish nation builders, Israel's vital to Jewish identity, Israel alters Middle Eastern Jewish history, Jewish identity, that was my chat last night. Zionism, Israel moves from total rejection to partial acceptance by the Arabs. 67 war unleashed learning and criticism of Israeli history. Diaspora Jews align in distance from Israel 20% to 80%. So 80% are still pretty well close to Israel, 20%, maybe I'll get a little bit further away because I don't particularly agree with everything that they're doing. And that's also part of the background that we're getting into when we talk about Israel on campus. Demographic changes in foci in the Jewish world. Well, I think it's fair to say that the Jewish memory for being the victim is disappearing. I think Israeli survival is no longer an existential issue for most who support Israel, except for the problems that Iran will pose. American Jewish youth evolved from particularistic to universal value. Is it necessary and appropriate, they may ask, to have a Jewish state? Assimilation and intermarriage in the Jewish world, we know, has been continuing at a pace of maybe 50% or more for about the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. From the 1990s forward, some Jewish youth came to campus with liberal embrace of the victim. They're underrepresented and oppressed. They need a voice. And particularism, as Jennifer reminded me the other day, gives way to universalism. Why is a Jewish state needed in the 21st century? Why base a state on religious identity? Now, those are the changes that have occurred within the Jewish American world, again, as a background to what is going on in terms of Israel on campus. These are changes. These are real sociological and demographic changes. And you can't stop them. You can't put a cork in them, and save the wine for the day after tomorrow and make it stop. You can't. Israeli history and historiography. I think for a long time, pre-state Israel or pre-state Israeli history was blotted out by the focus or the emphasis on teaching about the Holocaust. Holocaust studies became more dominant than Jewish studies. Then Jewish studies entered into the field, or Jewish studies entered the field, Holocaust studies hijacked the field, and Israel studies is a very late comer. Very late comer. In 1998, at Emory University, I was the first chair in Israel studies in North America. 1998. Crazy, right? Only 20 years ago. You had chairs in Holocaust studies in the early 60s, or rabbinic studies, or Talmudic studies. The study of modern Israel in the academic world is very, very new. So we really haven't turned out a generation of our own scholars to populate a field, if we wanted to populate them and if they actually could get a job in Israel studies. From 1948 and 1967, Israel survives. 67 war unleashes the unfinished realities mentioned last night. 48 through 79, its struggle and survival are the virtues that dominate Israel's story. The peace treaty. In the 1980s in America, the Association for Israel Studies only started. Greg Mahler was one of the founders. He was here yesterday. I was one of the early founders. He was a president. I was a vice president for a while. But it's not like the Association for Jewish Studies that started in the 60s, or the American Historical Association that started in the 60s or 80s, or the American Political Science Association. I mean, the study of Israel in the United States is barely out of kindergarten. Barely out of kindergarten. And inquiry into Palestinians and the evolution of Palestinian historiography came about, as I noted yesterday, as a result of the 1967 war. And at the end of the 80s, a new group of historians, as Aaron pointed out, began to write and talk about what really happened in 1947 to 49. Were Israelis responsible for the displacement, for the dispersion? How responsible were they for what became to be known as original sin against the Arabs? And that literature began to seep itself into how syllabi were chosen when Israel was taught in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And what another emphasis I'll make, I'm not sure where it appears on what slide, 80% of what is taught in American universities about Israel is taught in the context of the conflict. It's not taught in the context of Israeli literature, or Israeli sociology, or Israeli music, or Israeli culture. It's taught in terms of the conflict. And if it's taught in terms of the conflict, and if professors who are teaching the conflict are choosing the syllabi, and they're choosing the books that go into the syllabi, you can begin to understand why there seems to be a slant against Israel on major campuses in the United States. And there have been all sorts of surveys done by Brandeis, by a whole series of other organizations to take a look at how Israel was taught. And the conclusion that they all come to for over the last decade is it's taught in terms of the conflict. It's not in terms of Jews taking control of their own destiny. It just doesn't happen. Or it doesn't happen very frequently. What do our rabbis learn at JTS and HUC? What do they know about Israel? Most of them spend a year in Israel, usually their first year. But are they learning about Israel, or are they learning about ancient connection of the land of Israel to the people of Israel? And then are they then focusing on political issues of the contemporary? But do they take the ideas of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, failed emancipation, Zionism, old Yeshuv, new Yeshuv, building infrastructure for a state, do they learn that in their training? When I've interviewed over about 25 of them over the last year and a half, they say to me, Ken, that's not what we learned. We took a course on modern Israel at HUC or JTS, but we didn't do anything else. We didn't go from 101 to 201 to 301 to 401. We have a very prescribed curriculum. Fine. But then if they go and they stand on the bima and they want to talk about Israel, what they're learning is what they're reading from the contemporary, which is perfectly legitimate. But they'll filter it out according to their own outlooks. Or they'll decide to filter it out according to their own outlooks and then not talk about Israel from the bima because they don't want to be accosted during some Oneg Shabbat. They don't want it from the left and they don't want it from the right. Let's get kids to the bima for Bubby and Zaidi, say the brachot, but then what do we do afterwards? What have we done historically afterwards? I went to an afternoon congregational school on Long Island in the 1950s, at Hempstead, New York. He was a nice man. He was a nice guy. Whatever I got from my parents. At least my recollection of it. And I don't think Temple Beth Israel on Fulton Avenue in Hempstead, New York was terribly different than a lot of other synagogues. Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday education, up into the bima, and then afterwards. I don't remember doing anything from age 13 to 18. Zero. Haven't done any survey research to know what now happens after kids get to the bima. And do they do convocation? Do they do confirmation? Do they do Hebrew high school? I asked a guy in New York who runs the Jewish Educational Project, and he told me there used to be something like 15 or 18 Jewish high schools, secular Jewish high schools, run through congregations. 15 to 20 years ago, he said there are 3 left in New York City. 3. No one's interested. Too many other things to do. What do leaders of American Jewish organizations know about Israel? Do they go to lectures and they go on trips? Is there beef? And I've had this come to me from 4 leaders of Jewish federations. We were on a trip together for a couple days, and it's anecdotal. I didn't do any survey research. I'm not indicting American Jewish leadership, but they said, we learn about this on the run. We learn this because we invite someone in to give a chat about the matzav. It's always the matzav, always the matzav, always the matzav. What's the situation? I can remember coming to Atlanta in '77, and all lectures dealt with bringing some colonel, bringing some general, bringing some professor and talking about the current situation, but rarely putting it into, well, this is why we had to do it. Rarely. If I'm exaggerating, I apologize, but you're getting my drift. How are supplemental school and day school teachers prepared about Zionism, Israeli history, and politics? Answer your own question. Look at yourself, ask yourself the question, what did I learn and when did I learn it? And how did I layer my knowledge? I can't sit here and tell you that answer. How quickly do Jewish professionals and teachers change jobs? We did a survey of teachers who took our workshops 2 or 3 years ago. We found that more than 40%?
I think it was something like 60% were no longer in the school they worked at when they attended.
60%. And probably half of them left the teaching profession. So we've spent $3,500 for each one of you to be here. And chances are, in 4 years, 20% of you won't even be in the field anymore. Well, that's okay. You can go, you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief, have a family, do whatever you want to do. It's all laudable. But there's a huge turnover in the profession. And if there's a huge turnover in the profession, how do you take this, whatever it is we gave you this week, whatever word you want to use, and how does that sort of slide over to the next person who comes along the way? I think there's a greater turnover in Jewish schools than there may be a turnover in private schools. I don't know about public schools. I can't even begin to think what the turnover is in public schools. Probably the turnover in public schools has to do with who's paying you more. So that's why people leave Oklahoma when they go elsewhere. How is Israel received on campus? 67, Israel is moves from being David to the Goliath. 80% of Israeli-related courses are in Arab-Israeli conflict context. And Jewish and Holocaust studies is not Israel studies. Jewish professors on campus, many of them don't know or don't care about where Israel sits in the minds of their kids. It's just not a priority. They have their other issues that have to do with their publications, that have to do with tenure. You can't expect the fact that someone happens to be Jewish and is in a university department somehow is going to step up and speak out on behalf of Israel. Besides which, whatever Israel's doing politically may not comport with what they feel philosophically. And consequently, they don't even want to hear about Israel. They don't want to get involved with anyone that relates. They don't want to show up at a lecture on campus that might relate to Israel. And then we had, over the last 20 years, students who overtly said, we don't like power. We don't like the use of power. We don't like Cheney and Bush and the war in Iraq. And certainly we don't like Trump. And if Israel is governed by the political right, and there's an affinity between the political right in Israel and the right of center politicians who are governing in the United States, there are many Jewish kids on campus and many non-Jewish kids on campus who don't like that alliance, who don't like what they see. They don't like the politics of both. And so what many organizations do, like the Jewish Voice for Peace, like Reset the Table, or what's the one, Not Now? If Not Now. What are these organizations? They are extra political organizations. They're outside the political spectrum, where individuals feel frustrated they can't change the political systems either in Israel or in the United States, so they coordinate and they collaborate with themselves because they want to make a difference. It's no different than what I may have done in the 60s at the University of Michigan in 1969 when I was one of 5 or 7 people who helped organize the Vietnam moratorium against the war. What could we do to change Nixon? What could we do to change Kissinger? I don't think it wasn't Kissinger at the time, it was Rusk. We couldn't. So we protested, we went to the streets, we organized, we tried to do it in a peaceful way. What they're doing now is they're trying to organize in a peaceful way in order to promote their political views. That's what they're doing. Yeah.
Why, I know you talked about the statistic that 80% of Israel courses are taught about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Is there a reason why, and as educational institutions, shouldn't they be looking at the professors and the syllabi that are being projected to give? Or is that not?
No one tells me what to put on my syllabus. And if I go to my chairman, and for 15 years I've been teaching a course on Arab politics, he's not going to say to me, why don't you teach a course on the Arab-Israeli conflict? And I've got tenure, and I say, Joe, I'd prefer just to keep teaching what I'm teaching. I teach my course on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I have for 20 plus years, because the university thinks students coming to Emory may come to Emory in order to take that class, or to realize they could take a class that's not going to be biased one way or another. And I'd say there are probably about 5 or 10, 15 peers of mine like that in different universities around the country. Administrators, department chairs don't control what we teach or what we choose to teach or what we include to teach in our syllabi. And therein itself creates tilts and bendings and prejudices. And we have people who give a course, for example, on Palestinian Israeli literature, 1945, 1949. That's the title of the class. And she happens to give a lot of A's. And you ask an Emory student, why are you taking that class? And the answer is, well, we take the class because we're guaranteed an A. We hold our nose because we don't like her politics, but we're guaranteed an A. All we have to do is spout back what is given. But the content of the class is not what you would call even-handed, for want of a better term. There's so many egregious examples of how the classroom was used for preaching rather than teaching. It would take me all morning to just go through it. American Jews grew to disagree with Israel I think I would say, beginning with an unfamiliarity of the Israeli right that took power in 1977. Then Begin, then Shamir, then settlements, and then the knock on the head for American Jews was the whole idea that Israel would mess around with the definition of who was a Jew. That was crunch time for Jews who were Reform and conservative in America that were converted by local rabbis. And the whole question of who is a Jew, it's not a question of who is a Jew. The whole question is, which rabbi converted you? That's what the issue is about. And the rabbinate in Israel said, don't like that person, his tzitzis aren't long enough in Denver, or wherever it was. American presidents disagree with Israeli prime ministers, and that added to the crustiness. Not in terms of giving Israeli necessary means to protect its security, but how Israel was managing the territories, what Israel was doing with the Palestinians, what was the issue of collective punishment, what was the effort in the Second Intifada for Israelis to move large troops into Jenin. And then the media came out and, blasted Israel for this, and this, and then the inquiries 5 and 6 months later said that it was an exaggeration, it didn't happen. Israel's engagement with Gaza, and you had the Goldstone report that labeled Israel as X, Y, and Z, bad, 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 and then Goldstone himself 4, 6, or 8 months later put up his hand and said, well, maybe the information I received was a bit biased, and maybe it wasn't the best kind of report. So what happens in the meantime is Israel's taking these, punches and black eyes. I'm not saying everything Israel does in its protection of its population is, what Mother Teresa would endorse. I think that's fair. But they try and go out of their way in order to protect innocence as best they possibly can, but sometimes they don't. But that's okay. I'm not sanctioning it. I'm saying that's what happens in war. Wars generally are not good for people. They're bad results. Wars come out with bad results. Then in the 70s, historians in the United States in general, and in the 80s, are lambasted because who they are, and the criticism comes from a professor of English at Columbia University, Edward Said, that says, if you happen to be a Western-trained historian, you don't have the right to teach about the third world because you're biased. You have no objectivity whatsoever. And it catches fire among some people in the academic realm, and Edward Said now becomes a major book that's read. And back in 2006, I guess, I gave a presentation at the Association for Israel Studies annual meeting, maybe 2008, I don't remember right now. And I had taken a look at the literature that was used in Arab-Israeli conflict classes. And the book that was read the most was Edward Said, Orientalism. And it barely touched on the Arab-Israeli conflict. But his influence was profound. Aaron, have I understated it? Not, anything you want to add to it, or is that? Okay. And then information, opinion, research, fake news, books, and the internet all came along, and then people started writing whatever they wanted to write. And no one developed filters to find out what people were writing, whether they were accurate, whether they were exaggerated. How many times have we received an email about Israel or the conflict when someone has written in the subject line, best video you've ever seen? How many of those do you get a week? Right? Best article, a must read. Must read, best article now has no meaning. No meaning. So then you have to go in yourself, and then you have to make your own determinations. And then you finally put your hands up and say, Lizman, I'm just not going to take the time to do this. That's it. I'm just going to leave it alone. You have international delegitimization of Israel, the Durban Conference in the early 2000s that was highly antagonistic toward the state of Israel. You can Google Durban Conference and Mary I want to say Robbins. It wasn't Mary Robbins. It wasn't Mary Richards. Mary Robinson, maybe? Yeah. Who headed the Durban Conference, and she allowed a whole series of resolutions to pass that were very, very negative, very, very negative toward the state of Israel. And it was picked up by the left side of European population and a lot of people outside of the Middle East. And there was this sanction now that the United Nations had said that Israel was an apartheid state, was engaged in ethnic cleansing. And then all along you've had a bunch of UN resolutions that 98% of the time sort of put Israel there as guilty, unless the United States is voting to veto a resolution. But if it's a General Assembly resolution, it's written and it's done. And then you have a series of writers, both in the United States and in Israel. Tony Jute wrote extensively in the New York Review of Books in the late 90s and early 2000. Once every 2 or 3 months, he must have had 25 to 40 articles in which he's just beating Israel over the head whenever he had the chance and opportunity. And who reads the New York Review of Books? Not left-wing liberal, not right-wing conservatives, but people who were tendently sometimes on the left, or more on the left than the right. I can't speak for the readership of the New York Review of Books, and I hope I'm not misstating myself, but most people who I know read the New York Review of Books were left of center, and they felt what Tony Jute was writing was really true, it was right on the money. And when you read someone who reinforces what you believe, then you believe it more. Richard Falk, Princeton professor, became a staunch anti-Israeli, staunch advocate against Israeli policies in the territories. Staunch. Who is the MIT professor, Aaron? Chomsky, right? So Chomsky and Falk became, they trotted around the country and gave these talks about Israel was bad, Israel was doing this. Shlomo Sand, an Israeli, Tel Aviv University professor, he writes a book in the early 2000s, said Jews aren't a people. It's an invented reality. Sorry? Yeah. Right. And then you had a bunch of other historians who jumped in and said Israel did this and Israel was bad. And then you had the guy that I worked with for 15 years, the President of the United States, who jumps into this not because these others have, but because he has a deep passion and a deep feeling for the Palestinians, and he feels hurt that he was not allowed to continue as president, and he had to leave office in 1981, and he wishes he could have stayed in office and continued into the 1980s, and as he said to me numerous times in small meetings and backs of cars, he would say, Ken, if they'd only give me a chance, I could resolve this. I mean, all they have to do is give me a chance. And he tried very hard to try and encourage the Reagan administration to appoint him. And the Reagan administration wanted nothing to do with the Carter's 4 years in office because it was seen as A, democratic, and B, he had many failures. And the Reagan administration didn't have the Bunsen burner going like Carter did when it came to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Just didn't have it. And so the whole idea of Palestinian autonomy sort of withered, and it went away, and nothing continued. Then one of the reasons that the Carter Center was established was precisely for Carter to have a podium upon which he could speak about issues that were of great importance to him when he was president. Arms control, Latin American democracy, Middle East peace. These were burning issues for him. He didn't want to turn the Carter Center, located here in Atlanta, he didn't want to turn the Carter Center into a debate about domestic issues, not energy and not deregulation. Many of these issues had really bitten him as president, and he was much more interested in the foreign affairs issues. And in 1981, maybe 82, sometime in the spring, I met him at a reception at the Woodruff Medical Center, and he said to me in passing, he said, "Would you like to come work in the new institute that I'm creating?" I said, "I don't know very much about it." I said, "I've been working on a university committee to try and figure out what it might look like, but I don't know much more other than what we've presented to the president of the university." He said, "Well, I'll make an appointment for you to come downtown to my office and we can chat a little bit more." And I went down about 2 or 3 weeks later and we're sitting there and I said, "All right, so give me the shorthand. What is it that you want to see as a result of the conflict? What's the end product?" He said, "I think there should be 2 states for 2 peoples." I said, "A Jewish state and a Palestinian state?" He said, "Yes." I can live with that. I mean, if that's your view, that's pretty good. Now remember, 1982 was not a time that people were talking about a 2-state solution. If you were in the Jewish community and you were talking about a 2-state solution, you were advocating the digestion of pork for Orthodox rabbis. It was a horrendous, it was not even to be considered. And the anger that was tossed at me from the Jewish community for agreeing to work with Carter was huge. You know, here I am at Emory University. I don't have tenure yet. They thought, well, here's an opportunity to bring this guy on board who can help Carter do something that he was really interested in. We decided that our first major event would be on the Middle East. That happened in 1983. We went to the Middle East, 83, 87, and 90, 3 weeks trips. I wrote a book with him in 1984 called The Blood of Abraham. Monitored Palestinian elections in 1996. And we stayed in touch and close, and he would come lecture in my class, and he wanted someone who could provide him contemporary data about Middle Eastern things. He knew I read a little bit of Arabic, and I wrote him monthly reports, maybe 2 or 3 pages long, and he liked it. He found it to be fascinating. The Reagan administration, curiously, did not give him the intelligence briefings that he was due, and that really angered him. So I ended up being sort of like an equivalent of a CIA analyst plus someone who would help correct an op-ed piece or something. I mean, I don't know how to describe what I did. So Carter delegitimizes his assault on history, and in 2006 he writes this book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. What time is it, Rich? 11:15. So he writes a book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And in it, he has portions of it that are just totally wrong or false. And he has portions of it that he invented. And how do I know that? Because I was the guy who was taking the minutes at the meeting when we were sitting with Assad in November of 1980. And he writes one thing in the book, and I got my notes, and there's no similarity. In his writings, he continues to write about how Israel's responsible, Israel's at fault. And I hadn't really worked intensely with him for more than a decade. I was still a Middle East Fellow of the Carter Center. hadn't done very much with him except the monitoring of the Palestinian elections in '96. So I still had a title of Middle East Fellow of the Carter Center. I was in Portland, Oregon with my wife, and we were, she went to get her teeth cleaned, and I think she went to get her hair done. She moved to Atlanta about 4 years earlier, and she still liked going to the same dentist and the same person who did her hair. Just give me someone who's going to clip my hair, and I'm happy. Anyway, so I got dropped off at the only place in the world that every academic wants to be locked in overnight, and that's Powell's bookshop. Okay? Everyone wants to be locked up in Powell's because it's like 3 floors and 2 blocks of used books. And you just want to eat and eat and eat. Oh, she drops me off at Powell's. I go look at the books that are out there that are, for sale. The most recent ones are always in the front of the store, and there was Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. It had been out for 5 weeks already. I read some controversial reviews of it, and I said, look, I've got an hour and a half. I'll just pick up the book and sit down with it. So I picked up the book, and I sat down with it, and I've thumbed through it. And I come across these passages that are recollections of what was said to him in 1990 by Assad or by Shamir or whomever it was. And then I hauled out the trusty computer, and I have all my notes and everything that I've ever done in my life are sitting in there. By the way, it's backed up in the cloud and 5 other places. And I started looking at it, and then I thumbed to the back and I said, this is not right. This isn't true. Why is he doing this? And then I looked at the back of the book, and I saw that he was quoting UN Resolution 242. And then I read further, and I found a really egregious sentence. And then I looked at the maps, and the maps that he used in the book indicated that the Israelis in 2000 at Camp David, between Barak, Arafat, and Clinton, the maps portrayed Israel as not having given any kind of concessions to the Israelis. Right next to him is Dennis Ross's book, Missing Peace. And Dennis Ross's book is 800 or 900 pages long. I mean, it's a great book to read, but also if you have a door that won't close, you use it as a book jam. And Dennis is a good friend. So I walk out of Powell's, dial Dennis's phone number. I said, Dennis, did you see Carter's book? He said, yeah, what did you notice, Ken? I said, the maps. They're your maps. I said, what else? I said, he changed the legend and he changed the maps. I said, who drew those maps? He said, I did at Camp David 2000. I'm the one who drew the maps. I said, so where did he get the maps? He said, he probably got the maps out of someone who copied my maps. I said, are you going to do anything about it? He said, my lawyers are talking to his right now. I said, are you going public on this? He said, no, I can't. Well, the discussion's going on. Friday, we got on a plane, came back to Atlanta, went to Charleston, walking along the beach that Friday night, and I turned to Lynn and I said, what am I going to do? She said, you have to make that decision. I can't do that for you. And then she paused. She never met my father, and she said, what you have to do what your father would tell you. She said, your father was a man of strength, believed in paying his taxes, flying the American flag, voting in every election. He was a man of integrity. And he would always tell you, along what you've told me, he said, all you have is your reputation. I went upstairs, I wrote my letter of resignation, resigned from the Carter Center. That was on a Saturday. It made it to the president of the university and to the director of the Carter Center. And on Monday morning, it was on the bottom half of the front page of the New York Times. I sent it to 6 people, 6 of my former students and 5 or 6 relatives. On Tuesday, I had received 8 copies of my own resignation letter and a whole slew of emails. I mean, I didn't know that the internet worked this fast. Then the whole series of interviews were coming. Would you speak on MSNBC? Would you speak on CBS? Would you go on the evening news? Would you do CNN? And they kept coming and they kept coming. I did about 2 or 3 a day, and I did a couple of radio interviews. It got to be Wednesday, and my son, who was working for Joe Lieberman at the time, he had helped Lieberman get elected as an independent in Connecticut, and he had gone up with Lieberman for 60 days to work in Lieberman's media and help him on a day-to-day basis. Todd called me on the phone about 7:30 on that Tuesday night, and he said, "Ken, you have to stop doing all this media." I said, "Why?" He said, "He's a former president of the United States and he can bury you." I said, "What do you mean he can bury me? He wrote a bunch of lies." He said, "Dad, take my word for it. You have no idea what the media can do to your reputation. And you have to do exactly what Grandpa told you." "Okay, Todd, no more. No more interviews." That was 7:30. 20 of 8, his older brother Jason calls me on the phone and says, "Hey, Dad, you really ought to take seriously what Todd has told you. I think you should stop doing all these interviews. It's not going to be good for you in terms of the rest of your teaching career." I said, "Jace, you're absolutely right. No more." And then at 10 of 8, I got a call from Andrew, the youngest, who said, "Hey, Dad, I agree with Jason and Todd. Just knock it off." So all 3 boys weighed in on me. Right? It was a great half hour. And Patricia and Todd are walking through Georgetown. And I'd done an interview earlier in the day with MSNBC, and Todd and Patricia are walking past one of these bars in Georgetown, and there I am on the TV, and Patricia turns to Todd and says, "I see your dad really stopped, huh?" I didn't do any more. I got one more phone call from Hannity. He wanted me to do an interview on Friday. Friday night, our congregation, Or Hadash, had a special evening in which grandparents and grandkids were making dreidels together. And I said to Hannity, or whoever the booker was, I said, "I can't come Friday night because I think I'm finished with the interviews, and it also happens to be something I'm doing with my grandson." And I got 2 phone calls and finally a 3rd phone call from Hannity saying, "You really have to join us." I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." And they didn't. So I went to the Or Hadash event and had latkes and made dreidels. I then took about 3 or 4 months to write a real lengthy article about my problem with Jimmy Carter's book. And I reacted to it because, as you know, this entire website and most of what we do at the Center for Israel Education is based on sources, based on the text, based on what it says. And there's a certain idol worship I have for the truth and the text, or what the text says. And what Carter did was he deviated from the text in such a way because he wanted to impose his own view over reality. That's not what Resolution 242 says. It says withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict. It doesn't say mandate, doesn't say requires, and certainly doesn't, and there was certainly no agreement made by Menachem Begin to do this. Now, someone would say, "Oh, come on, Stein, why are you so pissed off about a couple of words placed in the wrong place?" Because the couple words placed in the wrong place is precisely why Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, because he didn't want to apply Resolution 242 to the West Bank. Now, you can say that was a bad decision on his part, but it was an agreed-upon text. And now we know not only was agreed-upon text, it was a text that the Carter administration wanted to change all during the negotiations at Camp David. Many of you heard our colleague Jacob Zak yesterday talk about Carter and the Jews. Jacob and I and Eli and interns are working now on the memorandum of the conversations that existed or took place between the Israeli delegation and the American delegations at Camp David. Those memorandum of conversations are not available at the Israel State, are not available at the National Archives. They're not available at the Carter Presidential Library. I mean, how many times has Jay gone over there? Jay, how many times have you gone over there to try and find these things? Dozens. I mean, he's a great snoop. He's a great snoop. Even his snooping ability, and I'd give him, a merit badge of either a Life Scout or an Eagle Scout for snooping at the Carter Presidential Library. Now, what he said about 242 is different than this. This is his opinion. He's entitled to his opinion. Now, I may disagree with it, but he's entitled to his opinion. And I make that clear distinction. Then he wrote in the back of the book, read this one carefully. Read it. It's sanctioning the killing of Jews or Israelis. What was he thinking when he wrote that? Or did he write it intentionally because that's what he really feels? Out of that quotation, the only question I get from people is, Carter must be an anti-Semite. That sentence caused 12 members of the Carter Center Board to resign. All the Jewish members except one resigned. And Carter gave a talk in Brandeis. He said, my book has not stimulated anti-Semitism at all. Well, there it is, translated in Arabic, appears next to Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat and Mein Kampf. Okay, you can say being a book associated by what's next to it doesn't necessarily make it. But he said, I give no aid and comfort to those who equate racism with Zionism. He said it George Washington. He also said it Brandeis. And this is what we get from the skinhead website. I'm so glad that people are finally stating their beliefs on Jews and hopefully will continue. As for Carter, he knew the attacks would start with the book publishing. He did not waver and has gained much respect from many people around the world. The fact that a former president is speaking out about racist Israel is a great wake-up call for Joe Sixpack. Now, when you put something out and you articulate a position, people read it. You may have a readership of one. But if you've been a former president of the United States and you put it out, that's like 5 LeBron Jameses. Now, I can't tell you what impact Carter's assault on Israel has had in the general community or amongst people who want to boycott Israel or delegitimize Israel. But we found at least 11 syllabi at major American universities where Carter's book and Shlomo Sand's book and Edward Said's book are the 3 of the 4 books that are used to teach the kids about the conflict. That's how data and information flow into the public realm. We have 5 minutes left from Rich. Let's take some quick questions. We'll see if we can try and answer them. The issue about Israel on campus is complex. It's detailed. It has to do with how the American Jewish community has changed demographically. It has to do with what kids are interested in on campus. It has to do with how professors choose syllabi and which professors preach rather than teach. There's so many aspects of this. Just so many. Yes, please.
Have you ever spoken to Jimmy Carter after this?
Nope.
Why he did this?
No. I got an email from him at one point in which, or I think it was an email, said, I wish you would desist from criticizing me in the book. And I sent back a handwritten note. I said, I'll desist when you revise, you put out a second edition of the book and you take out all the falsehood. Of course I'll desist. And never got a response. Yeah?
Do you think he's an New Testament?
Why couldn't you just... Rich, are we over? Can I go now? You know, Jacob Zach yesterday did a presentation on Carter and the Jews. And going back and looking at the research, we find is Carter had a distant relationship with the American Jewish community when he ran for office. And when he entered office, he had an equally distant and was growing his distance with the American Jewish community and with Israel. We know that from the documents that we've been able to gain from the Carter Presidential Library and from other sources. There are a couple of examples in which I think he articulated a position that was clearly questioning the legitimacy of someone being Jewish. He once, in Cairo, leaned back in the back seat of the limousine and asked me point blank, and this was on our third trip in '90, he asked me, do you ever think your life would have been different if you had embraced Christ? And he's also the very same person who, during our first trip to the Middle East, we left Israel, we went to Syria, and then we went to Beirut. And as we're flying back from Beirut to Morocco at 30,000 feet, he pulls out a challah, the steward pulls out a challah in this private 727, equivalent of 727. He pulls out a pair of candles, or the steward does, puts a Kiddush cup on the table, and says to me, Rosalind, me, his secretary and me, and said, Ken, will you say the blessing over the wine like Begin did at Camp David the first Friday night there? I said, I don't know how Begin did it, I can only tell you how I'll do it. So there we are at 30,000 feet, and I'm saying Kiddush. So there's a respect for me being Jewish. But that doesn't mean he can't dislike Israel immensely, which we all know he did. Jay, is that an understatement? Disliked Israel immensely? What? Right. No, what he did out of office is different than what he did. I got the signal for one more minute.
One more question.
Yes, please.
So my daughter is about to start college.
Speak into the microphone.
My daughter is about to start college next year. What kind of advice do you have for her?
Be sure her parents have, the advice is be sure her parents have saved a lot of money. I would say this to anyone who's going off to college or any school, where they are able to help determine the courses they take. The key is always to take people and not to take course topics. The key is you learn from people. And it may not be a person who is teaching in an area that you find to be interesting. Your daughter may be interested in art history or religion, but there may be a history of political science professor or professor of film studies who's just phenomenal. Take that professor. Even if it's not in the major, because you learn, your mind will be expanded by learning from a person. Just because a title could be Sex and the Single Woman in 16th century Black Africa, it may be taught by a dud. The other thing is, any kid who goes off to school, you're paying a lot of money to choose courses. In other words, you have to choose your courses, 4 or 5 a semester. So you choose professors, but after you choose the professors, look at the syllabus. Do your due diligence. I can't speak for Jay, and I can't speak for Gabe, and I can't speak for Dan, but I'm sure they realize that if at least one course that they took over so far, that they have taken a look at the syllabus, they might not have chosen that particular professor. Reasonable? Jay? Gabe? Dan? That's Miami, University of Washington, and Emory. There's a lot of money spent on making choices. Thank you.